Começa agora o programa 20 Minutos com Breno Altman.
Bom dia! Está começando mais uma edição do programa 20 Minutos Internacional. Nosso convidado é o britânico Jeremy Corbyn. Foi líder do Partido Trabalhista entre setembro de 2015 e abril de 2020. Parlamentar desde 1983, destacado militante dos movimentos anti-guerra e em defesa dos direitos humanos, tornou-se o principal porta-voz da esquerda trabalhista. Mesmo não tendo o apoio da maioria dos parlamentares de sua legenda, conquistou e manteve a liderança da legenda graças à adesão amplamente majoritária das bases partidárias. Afastou-se do cargo depois da derrota eleitoral de 2019, frente aos conservadores de Boris Johnson, quando o Partido Trabalhista perdeu 60 assentos no parlamento, caindo para 202 cadeiras, o pior resultado desde 1935. Antes de começar a conversa, gostaria de pedir que façam uma assinatura solidária de Opera Mundi em nosso site ou se tornem membros pagantes de nosso canal no YouTube. A imprensa independente precisa da tua ajuda para se sustentar e se desenvolver. Também peço que curtam e compartilhem esse vídeo, além de ativarem o sininho do canal. São ações que ampliam nossa audiência e nossa receita publicitária. Como a entrevista foi previamente gravada para poder ser legendada em português, infelizmente nossos espectadores, dessa vez, não poderão fazer perguntas ao nosso convidado. Good morning, Mr. Corbyn. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation. An honor to have your presence at our 20-minute show.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Mr. Corbyn, to discredit you, sectors of the conservative press nicknamed you Crazy Corbyn. How would you define yourself politically and ideologically? Socialist, Republican, Marxist? Who is Jeremy Corbyn?
Well, we've had many years of the British media being abusive to individual politicians and always trying to reduce the debate to personal abuse and name-calling. I've always refused to indulge in that kind of political exchange, and I still refuse to. As far as I'm concerned, I'm proud to be a member of Parliament for the community that I serve, where I live, and have been elected on 10 occasions for exactly the same district by very large majorities. I am a socialist, I'm a peace lover, I'm an environmentalist, and above all, I try to ensure that the voice is given to others, particularly those who are underrepresented in politics and in life, but also those that cannot achieve the best of their abilities because of poverty, because of bad housing, because of difficult work, or because of poor levels of education. So I commit myself to equality and justice. And internationally, we have to reckon with the results of the coronavirus crisis has increased inequality and poverty across the world, and that the international process since 2001, since 9/11, has been one of persistent wars, has been the growth of irrational non-state actors, i.e. groups that do crazy things. But the wars have provoked that in Iraq, Afghanistan, and the bombing of Syria and Libya. And we have, as a result, a more divided world. The question now is in which direction we're going to go. Are we going to continue on a world of greater and greater economic inequality and promotion of free market economics? Or are we going to go in a direction of recognizing that our health, all of our health, depends on the good health of everybody else as a principle. And lastly, because I realize I'm giving a long answer to your very reasonable first question, that the environmental crisis is an absolutely serious and crucial issue. It is, yes, emissions, global warming, of course. It's also biodiversity. It's also our attitude to things, to material, to nature, and to the rest of the planet. We cannot go on exploiting this planet in the way that we do and expect future generations to be able to survive. And so there are huge issues there. Politics has to be about inclusion and representation of all people. Otherwise, you end up with politics protecting the powerful, who are normally rich, normally an elite, and always a minority.
You have represented an impressive renewal of the Labour Party, putting it in the position of clear antagonism to neoliberal policies. Despite the good results in 2017 elections, there was a very hard defeat 2 years afterwards, which led you to leave the Labour leadership, taken up by the most conservative sectors of the party. Is there no chance for the socialist left to come to government in the United Kingdom? What are the reasons for such a hard defeat, in your opinion, Mr. Corbyn?
I became leader of the party in 2015. At that time, the party had just suffered an election defeat, and my whole pitch, my whole demand on assuming the leadership of the party was about challenging the principles of austerity and free market economics. It was about inclusion of people and about redistribution of power and wealth, because we'd seen a massive redistribution the other way following the banking crisis of 2008. Party membership rose from 200,000 or less than 200,000 to 600,000 by the time that I stepped down from the leadership at the beginning of last year. And I was proud of that. And I tried to develop the party in the direction of a community basis and a community organizing. And indeed, I'd watched and learnt quite a lot from political movements in Brazil about mobilizing people in their communities on housing, on health, on education, on security, and all the issues mobilized on, as well as the political message. So we were not just an electoral machine. The opposition I faced within the right of my party was enormous from the very beginning, and there was an attempt to remove me as leader less than 9 months after I'd been elected leader. And we then had to defend my position both legally by going to court and then also in another election within the party and the trade unions, which I won a second time with an increased majority. The opposition to the policies we put forward were huge, both within the party, from the right of the party, but also on a massive scale by our newspapers. The 2017 election, we went into it, and I was determined that we would go into it knowing that we were in a weak underdog position. We were on 24% in the opinion polls at the time the election was called. We went out and campaigned very hard all over the whole country, and I did a very large number of rallies and events all over the country, and we ended up with over 40% of the vote, the highest vote achieved for a very long time by the Labour Party. After the 2017 election, which we didn't win, unfortunately, that to me was obviously the great tragedy of it. We then went into a period when there was an endless debate about what to do post the referendum on European Union membership. The majority of Labour voters had voted to remain within the European Union. a very large majority of Labour Party members held a similar view. But there is a significant minority of both Labour supporters and party members who supported leaving the European Union, but were not tied up with the sort of ultra-nationalism of those that fought the Brexit campaign to leave. And then there was a massive campaign for a second referendum, which meant that areas of the country that voted overwhelmingly Remain were apparently in favour of a second referendum, others weren't. And it was a huge issue within the party. I met the European Union many times. I set out in outline form what we as a government would do, which would be to have an effective trade and political relationship with the European Union, albeit outside it. Many in the party thought very differently on this, and we concluded with what was seen as a compromise position within the Labour movement, which was that we would negotiate a future relationship with the European Union and put that alongside Remain in another referendum, which would be held within 6 months of the 2019 general election. This was a way of trying to bridge the gap between Leave and Remain, but also I pointed out 100 times, 1,000 times, that whether you voted Leave or Remain and you were living in poverty and an insecure job on a short-term contract and your children were in an overcrowded school and you had health problems that weren't being properly attended to and you needed social care and all the other things, your interests were exactly the same as somebody else in that situation, whether they voted Leave or Remain. And Boris Johnson totally dishonestly fought the election campaign on the basis he'd get Brexit done, do a trade deal with everybody around the world and all would be fine. I pointed out in the election campaign that a trade deal with the United States would involve privatization of our very precious National Health Service, and that's exactly what's happening. The election result was that we lost some support from 2017, but the electoral system in Britain is first past the post, and so quite small changes of opinion have a massive effect on the number of parliamentary representatives you have. It'd be a much smaller change in a proportional representation system. Anyway, we didn't win the election and we lost seats, although we still got over 10 million votes, which was more than at any other election for the Labour Party going back to until 2001. And so whilst the seats we lost were terrible and that result was obviously not good, I'm not prepared to say it was a complete write-off of our policies, because all examinations by opinion polling of Labour supporters on their views on our policies were that they supported public ownership of water, supported public ownership of the postal system, of the railways, the cooperative development strategy we put forward, and the idea of a national education service to provide equality of education opportunities across the whole country, and a green industrial revolution. All of those individual policies were overwhelmingly supported. The media attacks on all of us as in leading positions of the party were relentless, and I received the highest level of media abuse of any political leader ever in Britain, with over 80% of all newspaper reporting being supremely negative towards me. So we did have a huge mountain to climb. And whilst obviously I deeply regret the result that we achieved, I don't regret the policy changes we brought about within the party. I don't regret the number of young people we brought into political activity for the first time. And you know what? They're still in political activity. We are meeting and marching in support of health workers' decent pay campaigns, Green New Deal, media ownership reform, and all these issues. And the project that I founded, the Project for Justice and Peace, is central to all of those activities. And so politics is, yes, about electoral success or not, but it's also about what you achieve in your own community. Think of your own country in Brazil. the radical local government places that have grown up around Brazil, those movements in the favelas and other places that have empowered people. That's what politics is about, empowering people.
Do you think, Mr. Corbyn, that the Labour left wing will be able to lead the Labour Party again? Or would it be time to think about an independent party project?
The Labour Party is a almost unique political party in the world, in that it was founded by trade unions. It was started out as the Labour Representation Committee of the Trade Union Congress, the central trade union body.
Maybe very similar to the Workers' Party in Brazil.
In many ways, yes, there are many similarities. Yeah, and then it only 20 years later developed on a local basis with constituency parties. And even now, it is a federal structure in the party, in that half of all conference votes go to the trade unions, and trade unions are affiliated to the local parties as well as to the party nationally. And I personally think that's very important. We won the leadership by a popular outgoing campaign, which we recruited people to the party and to register as supporters, which gave them a vote in the elections. We did it by mobilizing people, by a cultural mobilization, by a mobilization of hope and rejection of neoliberal economics. Can that win again? Absolutely, because none of those demands have gone away. Indeed, everything we pick up now is that people see the way in which this government has created further inequality, and the way in which on a global scale, the number of billionaires is now at an unprecedented level at the expense of the poorest in your country, in my country, and on a global basis. So is there an opportunity in space for that simple socialist message of redistribution of power and wealth? Absolutely there is, absolutely. And that is what I spend my time doing, working on that.
After the 2019 defeat, several leaders of the Labour left were punished and suspended by the new party leadership. You yourself had your membership suspended, accused of lenience in combating anti-Semitism. This has been a recurrent argument, in fact, to face the current represented by you, the tendency, the wing represented by you. What's the reason for these attacks under this kind of accusation of lenience or even anti-Semitism?
Let's be very clear. Anti-Semitism is a total poison in our society. Wherever it rears its head, whichever part of the world it rears its head, there can be no space whatsoever for any form of anti-Semitism. There can be no place and no space for any form of racism. Racism is designed to divide popular movements, to divide people, and to create and inculcate this sense of superiority of one group over another. That's where fascism bred from in Germany, and fascism was also very strong in France and Netherlands, to some extent in Britain before the Second World War. It wasn't just in Germany. We now see a rise of the far right in Europe. In Germany, the far right, and the growth in Hungary and other Central European countries. I inherited a party system and structure that I thought was weak, and was weak on dealing with issues of bad behavior by a very small number of party members. And so I introduced a much better system of disciplinary action where anyone had been thought to have committed any anti-Semitic or indeed any other racist act. The accusations made against me have been hurtful, yes, disgraceful, yes, and wrong. And my membership was suspended after I gave a response to the Equalities and Human Rights Commission report, which I accepted the results of that report and said the party should implement them. And my membership was very rapidly restored, in fact 19 days later, by an appeal committee which was made up of a very diverse, politically diverse group of people within the Labour Party. Sadly, the parliamentary party then suspended me from membership of the parliamentary caucus, which is what we're fighting at the moment. However, I remain a member of parliament. I am a member of the Labour Party, and I will fight back against this. And
was it a kind of revenge of the right wing against you?
I don't know what the motives of this are. All I know is what I believe. All I know is what I want to achieve in life. And so I think it's important that we actually move the discussion on to the more serious issue of the political choices facing people in your country, in my country, and around the world.
You have always been very active in international issues, in the fight against the war, and in solidarity with peoples oppressed by colonialism and imperialism, including the Latin American peoples. Recently, in this regard, you have launched the Justice and Peace Project. What exactly is it about, Mr. Corbyn?
We launched this after a lot of thought and a lot of discussion after the 2019 election. And what I wanted was the Project for Justice and Peace to be a place of community political activity, a place of mobilization of people in different campaigns, and a way of supporting people in the struggles that they have. And so we launched in January of this year, and 500,000 people attended the launch event, which was done virtually on Zoom, Facebook, YouTube, and so on, all those links. And 50,000 people in Britain have signed up for it and are supporters of the project. And we're working in 4 particular areas of policy. One is to challenge the system of media ownership and media control, including the way in which social media algorithms and other things decide essentially what we read and what we know and how we find things out, and support real journalism and real independence of the media. Today, for example, I was on a demonstration in support of Julian Assange outside the prison where he's being held at the present time. The second area of work is on economic justice, where we're working with trade unions on trade union recognition campaigns, working with people in the Right to Food campaign, because there are many people who are desperately poor in this country and have to rely on food banks and the generosity of others. That is wrong. They shouldn't have to. They should have sufficient income to achieve things themselves. So it is about that sense of solidarity, but it's about mobilizing and empowering people through local activities and local conferences. And we work very hard on that. And in a sense, we're doing the community organizing work, which I wanted the Labour Party to lead on. And sadly, my successor as leader of the party closed down the community organizing unit that I'd established almost the first thing that he did on taking office. The third area of work is on environmental. COP26 is coming up later this year, obviously a very important conference for lots of reasons, but it is about understanding that tackling the environmental crisis does not mean threatening those that work in industries like oil, like gas, steel, coal, all the other industries. It's about ensuring that we protect those jobs whilst at the same time investing in renewable energy and renewable industries. And I developed the idea of the Green Industrial Revolution as an active party policy, and I was very proud of the environmental nature of the manifesto that we put forward in the 2019 election. So we're working on all of that and working with the whole coalition of environmental groups ahead of COP26, which I warned last Saturday at a rally I spoke at, must not become an exercise in greenwash, but has to become something very real, and global emissions have to be dealt with, but also the sharing of technology and not blaming the poorest people in the poorest countries for global warming when it's actually the richest countries that have caused most global warming. And the last area of work is one of international solidarity, which I've spent my life campaigning in support of people through solidarity work in Latin America, in, for example, in Chile, in Argentina, in Bolivia, but also I was very involved in the struggle against apartheid in South Africa, and I've been very strongly involved in the support of the Palestinian people and their right to peace and their right to recognition. Most recently, we've been involved in supporting the trade unions in Myanmar and those that are fighting back against the military dictatorship there. So yes, international solidarity is a very important part of it. So these are huge areas of work that we've undertaken, and we're developing that in the best way that we can. It is about giving voice to people, and the events we organise involve people who are in the Labour Party, were in the Labour Party, now sometimes in something else or sometimes not in anything. It's about mobilising people to stand up for the kind of world society that we all want to live in.
And inside and outside the UK, is it an international project?
Yes, it is, of course. And we're working very closely with Progressive International, which has links all around the world. And I've done a number of meetings and conferences with them, including friends from your country, as well as other parts of the world, including India, South Africa, and so on. And so through Progressive International, we work very, very closely indeed. And in fact, I'm a member of the Council of Progressive International, as well as being a founder of the PJP.
Mr. Corbyn, one of the fundamental issues of democracy today is to prevent the justice system from functioning as an instrument of political struggle, the so-called lawfare. Did you follow the Lula case in Brazil? What's your opinion about it?
Thank you. I've been following the Lula case very closely, and indeed I've been following the PT and the work of Lula very closely. Indeed, I was in Brazil at the time of one of the electoral attempts of Lula, and I think it was 1998 when the PT didn't quite succeed in winning, but I remember campaigning with them in Sao Paulo at the time. And I've followed the difficulties that the PT government was confronted with, and also the successes in attempting to deal with the worst inequality and poverty that Brazil suffers. And we've worked very closely with Dilma during my leadership of the party, and indeed she kindly came to London and addressed a number of economic justice conferences that we hosted. I've also been appalled at the way lawfare has been used in order to effectively criminalize elected politicians, not just in your country, but what was used in Bolivia and what is also happening at the current time in Peru. And so it's a different form of attack on political liberation. In the past, it used to be done by a coup, by attacks, by undermining both militarily and economically an economy. And now it's done by economically undermining, but also going after the individuals who are at the head of it, in this case, Lula in your country. And so, yes, I do see it as a major issue around the world. And that's why Progressive International has been working very closely on challenging this whole process. But I think the lesson from Bolivia is a fascinating one. Over the years, it's been my pleasure to meet the leaders of different places, to meet Evo and talk to him at some length about issues, the way in which he and his party were removed from office by effectively a coup, the solidarity shown by the government of Mexico, by Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, in ensuring that Evo could get out safely and then go to Argentina, and from their campaign, and the en masse campaign very hard all over Bolivia, recognizing that, and I listened to this, it was very interesting, self-reflection by en masse, that they got too far away from their base whilst in government. I can understand how that happens, and I can see the difficulties, but they repaired the process very quickly and then dramatically won re-election, and I wish them well on their program. And so I also wish the people of Brazil well in the future, because you've suffered from corona like almost nowhere else in the world because of actions taken by your own government, and you have enormous levels of inequality, but you also have enormous resources, and you have enormous skill level amongst such a wonderful, if very diverse population. And so, yes, it is about solidarity around the world. If I could just develop this theme slightly, the events in the United States with the death of George Floyd were dramatic. Black Lives Matter already existed, but it was like a sort of lightning around the world. People saw George Floyd being killed by the police in real time, in broad daylight, on television. And Black Lives Matters moved to try and do something about that. Yes, to challenge that police power in the United States, but also to challenge the narrative of history that gives superiority over others. And I do think this decolonizing of the education system, as it's called in Europe, is very important, so that we understand what colonialism was about and we understand where our own history has come from. So I think that the development of BLM, Black Lives Matters, around the world is different in different places, but it's all really about a liberation of the mind, of an understanding of where we come from and where our civilizations come from, and how the knowledge we all share comes from everybody, from every community all around the world. Europe wasn't the only place that had science, that had maths, that had engineering. Others did too. It's that process we've got to develop. And people are liberated by understanding their own past and the history of struggle.
Mr. Corbyn, what's your assessment of the behavior of the British justice in the Assange case?
Well, Julian Assange is a formidable journalist who investigated a whole lot of things that he found out about what the US had done in Guantanamo Bay, what happened in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya, and Syria, and Palestine, and so much else. And he was invited to Britain in 2010 by the Guardian newspaper. And he was then working in this country and producing a lot of fascinating information, which was deeply embarrassing, particularly to the USA. He then, in order to prevent himself being extradited anywhere, went into the Ecuadorian embassy with the permission of the embassy and the then government of Ecuador, and stayed there for a number of years. And as we all followed the history of Ecuador, sadly, the succeeding government in Ecuador was not prepared to support Julian Assange, and he was then arrested at the embassy and taken into custody and faced an extradition charge to go to the United States. That extradition hearing took place, and he was not granted, or the US was not granted permission to extradite him to the USA, even though that final decision would have had to be made by the British government, because extradition always relies on the political decision of the government concerned, not just the legal process. Anyway, that was the decision, that he should not be extradited. At that point, any other person would have been released, and that would have been the end of the matter. In other words, he would have been freed on the basis he could not be removed to the United States. The reasons the judge gave were they were concerned about his treatment in the USA, and in particular his mental health following years in prison here, as well as hiding in the Ecuadorian embassy, but also what treatment he would face in the USA. The US government has given notice that they intend to appeal this decision, and in the meantime he is detained in a maximum security prison, which is a terrible place to detain anyone. It is, as its name suggests, very, very strict. He spends a great deal of time on his own. The facilities are very bad. The conditions are very bad. He's often tired and exhausted, lack of sleep, and all the other things that go with it. Yet there isn't any conviction against him. And that's why I was at the prison this morning with two parliamentary colleagues, Richard Bergen and Diane Abbott, presenting a letter signed by 17 more parliamentarians, in this case asking that we have an opportunity to meet Julian as public officials, and we're pressing that request, and we met the Deputy Governor to press that request this morning, and we'll continue to do so. But we've also addressed a letter to President Biden asking him to recognize what Julian has done in trying to bring about a free media in the world, and not proceed with the appeal against Julian's non-extradition. That's where we are at the moment. I feel very strongly on this matter, as I do for real journalists around the world who face all kinds of dangers for talking out against corruption, against cartels, against drug cartels, against military government, against repression and loss of human rights and injustice in every country of the world almost, but some countries are worse than others, and I think we've got to speak out on those. So whilst, yes, I get heavily criticised by the mainstream media in Britain, I have the utmost respect for those very brave journalists that tell the truth, whatever the dangers they face as a result of it.
Mr. Corbyn, what's your opinion of the USA blockade against Cuba and the serious economic sanctions against Venezuela, with the complicity of the European Union and the United Kingdom, which has frozen the Venezuelan gold at the Bank of England?
The blockade of Cuba and the sanctions by the United States against Cuba have gone on almost as long as I can remember. I remember the 1959 arrival in Havana of Fidel and Che Guevara, and then the development of the new Cuba. And the sanctions have been on Cuba almost continuously. And every year it's debated at the United Nations. And every year more and more countries come to realize how short-sighted and wrong the sanctions are. And the last time the General Assembly voted on it, there were only 2 countries that supported the blockade of Cuba. That was the United States and Israel. But the US uses the Helms-Burton Act in order to spread its tentacles very wide on all this. Britain has always recognized the government of Cuba, because the British tradition is to represent the de facto, to give recognition to the de facto government of a particular place. But British companies, like other European countries, are often scared to trade with Cuba because they would face sanctions in US courts. The same would apply to companies anywhere around the world and trade with Cuba. And so obviously the sanctions continue, even though they've been voted down by the United Nations. Likewise, the sanctions against Venezuela have helped to create shortages of necessary technical equipment and much else beside. And obviously the fall in the world price of oil affected the Venezuelan economy massively. And so I do think we have to challenge this whole principle of sanctions against them. Sanctions are an easy thing for politicians to vote for from the comfort of somewhere else. They're much harder to recognize the effects of them. The sanctions against Iraq after the Gulf War of 1991 cost the lives of hundreds of thousands of people in Iraq because of the shortage of medicines and other things that went with it. And that is the brutality of that process. And so I do think we have to speak up in opposition to those sanctions because of the devastating effect they have always on the poorest people.
Mr. Corbyn, we are finishing this interview, and I would like to ask, as I do with any other people we invite to the program, what have you read or are reading during the pandemic, and would like to suggest to our viewers? And which movie or series have you watched to or are watching to? And could you indicate who are accompanying us?
Well, I read a great deal, and I like to be reading 2 or 3 books at the same time because it keeps you on your toes. So I started reading last night a novel I was given on Sunday by Upton Sinclair, the American writer, about the Madrid uprising, or the defense of Madrid during the Spanish Civil War. I haven't got very far into it so far, but it's got a fascinating chapter which is set in a nightclub in New York, in which we've got somebody who thinks he's part of the elite, but actually in the cold light of the morning realizes he's not and doesn't have much money and is living on borrowed money and borrowed time. And so I'm not quite sure how he's going to develop in this novel, but I've got a feeling he might end up as a volunteer for the International Brigade fighting in Madrid. And so Upton Sinclair novels I find fascinating because they're set in the time of 1930s and 40s United States. And indeed, Upton Sinclair ran for governor of California in 1946. I'm also reading another book, which is by a young man called Julian Sasaya, who was a cycle courier in London. In other words, he rides his bicycle like this, very fast all around London, delivering packages and so on and so on. And he saw that somebody had got a world record in, I think, 2006 for riding a bicycle around the world, which from home to home, but going across Europe and Asia, then the USA, and then back to Europe. So it was 18,000 miles, a lot more in kilometers, about 24,000 kilometers. And so Julian decided he was going to challenge this, but he wouldn't do it with corporate sponsorship. He wouldn't do it with any backup system. He wouldn't do it with vast sums of money. He would do it on averaging 100 miles per day on his bicycle, which is about 140 kilometers, 150 kilometers a day. And he would do it by spending no more than 10 euros a day. And so he was sleeping out in his sleeping bag and so on. And anyway, throughout this journey, which I think was excessively fast, but he did do it in the time required, so he won the world record, was that his comments on the relative wealth of Western Europe, on life in China, on the condition of Uyghur people in Western China, on life in Thailand and New Zealand and so on, and the USA. It's a fascinating book, and he sent it to me, and I didn't know he'd sent it to me because it surfaced with a pile of other books. There's a lovely message there saying, Jez, please have a read of this. I hope you'll be inspired by what I observed around the world. So I read that, but I also read a lot of history books as well.
And series or movies you'd like to indicate?
Movies, I'm not incredibly knowledgeable or a great expert on movies, because I should be, I know, and I should be, but I don't really have time. I have an awful lot of things to do with the project and other things. So
you are more a bookman.
I tend to read.
You are more a bookman.
Yes, indeed. Books and gardening.
Books and garden.
Yeah.
And which football team are you for?
Arsenal.
Aston. Okay.
Arsenal.
Yeah. Ah, okay. I'm for Santos, Pelé Santos. Mr. Corbyn, I would like to thank you very much for your time and for this conversation of great interest to our audience. Thanks for the opportunity you gave to our viewers and to me.
Thank you very much, Breno. I've enjoyed the conversation.
Encerramos assim mais uma edição do programa 20 Minutos Internacional. O nosso convidado foi o líder político britânico Jeremy Corbyn. Agradeço pela audiência e até uma próxima oportunidade.
Para assistir novamente esse programa e a outras edições dos programas 20 Minutos, se inscreva no canal do Opera Mundi no YouTube. Curta e compartilhe nossos vídeos, deixe seus comentários. O jornalismo de Opera Mundi é mantido com o seu apoio. Faça uma assinatura solidária em www.operamundi.com.br. Com um pequeno valor mensal, você nos ajuda no desenvolvimento de um jornalismo independente e de qualidade. Obrigado pela audiência e até a próxima.